The idea of a continuing existence despite the passing of a person's physical form is one that has long fascinated humanity. But what if it were possible to force such an entity into being via the use of nothing more than sheer willpower? In this episode, we will examine a case in which that concept was tested and resulted in some degree of success, an undertaking which became known as the Philip experiment. Thanks to BetterHelp for this paid partnership. BetterHelp is an online service that connects you with a credentialed therapist who is trained to listen to you and give helpful, unbiased advice. I've shared with you before that I've struggled with anxiety most of my life. When I'm feeling anxious, it's hard for me to concentrate. My heart races and I often avoid situations that make me feel worse. I want to grow bedtime stories as a channel and podcast, so I don't like that my anxiety sometimes gets in the way of that. That's why I decided to try BetterHelp. I've started speaking with a therapist on the platform about ways to reduce my anxiety, and their guidance has been invaluable. Over 4 million people have used BetterHelp to start living a healthier, happier life. So if that's something you want too, visit betterhelp.com/bedtimestories. To get started, you fill out a questionnaire, and then you'll be matched with your therapist in most cases within 48 hours or less. And if that therapist isn't a great fit, you can switch at no extra charge. You can communicate with your therapist through messages or phone calls, whichever feels right for you. It's a more comfortable way to ease into therapy. If you think you might benefit from therapy, consider BetterHelp. Click the link in the description or visit betterhelp.com/bedtimestories. Clicking that link helps support this channel, and it also gets you 10% off your first month of BetterHelp, so you can connect with a therapist and see if it helps you. The reporter looked on, notepad in hand, as those assembled in the centre of the room continued to speak amongst themselves in hushed tones. Only one other person besides himself and the group was present, a colleague who had been appointed to remain alongside him for the duration of their meeting. The people who were seated around the small table before him all shared something of a loose association, but were fully aligned in their fascination with the afterlife. They had been conversing amongst themselves for several minutes now, recounting the history of a long-dead English nobleman, who appeared to have lived something of a colourful past. The journalist had been midway through recording some of this sordid history when he suddenly paused, detecting a visible flicker of the lights situated above him. Although only momentary, this temporary dimming went on to repeat itself several times. At the point he considered commenting on this phenomenon to his chaperone, the journalist's eyes suddenly widened in surprise. The table which the group was seated around seemed to shunt slightly to one side, before moving back to its original position. This unnatural occurrence would be repeated a further 3 times, much to the apparent joy and amusement of those in the centre of the room. The reporter began to scrawl in his notepad with some haste, attempting to document everything he was seeing, along with his own personal feelings about it. He then glanced up at the table, as there was an audible exclamation of wonder and surprise from those assembled there. To his astonishment, a light and translucent patch of haze seemed to have formed immediately above them, which slowly began to expand. Its smoke-like tendrils ventured forth to probe the surroundings, as if it was somehow alive and searching for something. It then began to glide across the small space towards the journalist and his escort. This prompted the visitor to hurriedly replace his notepad in his coat pocket and make a hasty retreat from the room. Somewhat bewildered, he was completely at a loss as to how he was going to present what he had just witnessed in his newspaper column the following day. It was a story of a human soul which had been successfully summoned at a séance centuries after its human existence had ended. However, the man that the soul belonged to had never actually existed. It was nothing more than a manifestation, a thought form, created by the small gathering of people who had summoned it. No matter what their wider political or religious views, every society throughout history has made reference to the existence of spirits and the notion of an afterlife. Stories have been passed down from one generation to the next, relating encounters with unknown spiritual entities or the souls of departed loved ones. Discussions on this subject have identified an apparent trend, wherein people who died under the most tragic circumstances seem unable to move on, tethered to a particular person or place with which they were previously associated, continuing to manifest within the physical realm. Quite often it has been theorized that it is the trauma or unexpected manner in which they died that has led them to remain upon the earth. Perhaps the horror of their departure proved too confusing to fully process, or generated an overwhelming sense of unfulfillment or regret, which then drew them back to the living. They then appear before startled witnesses, either repeating their actions at the point of their death, or issuing warnings about the manner of their passing. Scientific opinion on the phenomenon remains starkly divided, with some asserting that there may be unidentified energies or processes at work, forces which currently are not fully understood by the scientific community, but which somehow ensnare and preserve the souls of the departed. Others believe, however, that the spirits in question instead reside solely and firmly within the minds of those who have allegedly encountered them, somehow generated by the participants in the event, the side effects of varying degrees of protracted guilt or trauma. This somehow converts their own vision into a tangible apparition, which is then witnessed by third parties. During the 1970s, one group of researchers based in Canada attempted to demonstrate that it was the human mind which facilitated the appearance of ghosts. The basis of this idea lay within the previous work of the group's founder, a British academic named George Owen, who had emigrated to the country several years prior. Possessing a strong background in mathematics and physics, Dr. Owen had become fascinated with reports of poltergeist activity from around the world. As a result, he had travelled extensively, interviewing witnesses from across the globe and documenting commonalities between each of the different cases. Owen would eventually form the opinion that high degrees of stress being exerted on the minds of those involved had caused them to manifest seemingly supernatural encounters. After settling in Canada with his wife Iris and meeting various other like-minded individuals, he had gone on to form the Toronto Society of Psychical Research, or TSPR. In 1972, Owen had proposed a bold experiment to the members of this group, in which they would attempt to will a fictional ghost into existence, the spirit of a historical figure who had never physically existed, and whose backstory had been crafted completely by their own hand. They would attempt to manifest this entity using only the power of their minds, inviting it to appear before themselves and other witnesses. The proposal was readily accepted, with a group of 8 core members, including Owen and his wife, dedicating themselves to the undertaking. Having secured a psychologist named Dr. Joel Witten to act as an independent observer for the experiment, Owen then set about creating his subject. He and his colleagues would craft an intricate backstory for the spirit they intended to create, which they could recount in such great detail as to convince themselves it could only be real. The first factor which Dr. Owen and his colleagues decided upon with regards to the creation of their test subject was the time frame in which it had existed. Examining various historical settings, they were eventually drawn to 17th century England, focusing specifically upon the reign of Oliver Cromwell. This was a time which had been written of at length by the chroniclers of the age, but to an extent, still allowed sufficient absence of detail within which to insert their character. The recorded histories of later periods had proven too detailed, the high levels of information proving to be a restricting factor. In contrast, writings pertaining to earlier timeframes lacked sufficient context, creating too many questions which disrupted the protagonist's backstory. So, it was into this setting that the fictional character of Philip Aylesford was duly inserted, along with many tragedies and torments experienced within his lifetime. An aristocrat of no particular fame or notoriety, Aylesford was raised a Catholic, and had been a supporter of the king during the English Civil War. Now somewhat marginalised by the arrival of Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector, Aylesford had retired to his estate in Middle England, determined to avoid scrutiny from his new ruler. Several years prior, and before the onset of the conflict, Aylesford had married Dorothea, the beautiful daughter of a noble family which resided a short distance from his own lands. It soon became apparent, however, that the two were not a match, with both parties withdrawing from one another, trapped within a barren and fruitless relationship. Philip had gone on to rediscover happiness with a common woman named Margot, whom he had encountered one day whilst out riding alone. Bringing her back to the estate in the guise of a servant girl, the nobleman had enjoyed a short and passionate affair, right under the nose of his cold and unfeeling spouse. But Dorothea soon grew suspicious of the new arrival, denouncing Margot for trying to bewitch her unwitting husband using dark magic. Thinking only of his wealth and reputation, the hapless landowner had gone along with his wife's accusation, even giving evidence against his lover at her trial. He had stood in silence as Margot was convicted of witchcraft, and then suffocated his emotions as she was led from the courtroom to be burned at the stake. Months later, his servants had found Philip's body lying twisted and broken on the ground below one of the battlements of his home, having hurled himself to his death in guilt and despair. With the detail of his sad tale now decided, the group went as far as to engage a local artist to draw a picture of their creation, before then setting about willing him into existence. Under the watchful eye of Joel Whitton, the 8 members of the TSPR who had dedicated themselves to the experiment assembled on a weekly basis. During these meetings, they would discuss Philip's life in detail, questioning his actions and motives, exploring the grief that had led him to his tragic and untimely end. These discussions would then progress to invitations for the spirit of the dead nobleman to reveal itself, so that they could question him further on his life. Seated around the commissioned drawing of Philip, one member of the group would be nominated at each meeting to reach out with their mind. They would visualize the dead aristocrat and call him to attend, before going on to share what they had experienced with the rest of the group. An entire year would pass with no success, before Iris Owen proposed that they enact changes to the way in which they were attempting to make contact. Working under normal room lighting, as opposed to the candlelight they had previously been utilising, no one member was now allowed to act independently of the others. The group would instead silently reach out together in the hopes of contacting Philip's spirit, combining their efforts to manifest him. Almost immediately, this change in technique garnered results, with members of the group detecting a faint tapping upon the tabletop and walls. After several further meetings, the team devised a method for the spirit to communicate with them, recording a series of positive and negative responses to their questions. The audible knocking of their spectral visitor was later accompanied by physical movements of the table they were seated at, seemingly moving of its own accord a short distance from its original position and then back again, despite the group having only rested their fingertips upon it. As time passed, the table's movement in response to their questions became more pronounced, sometimes tilting to one side or rocking back and forth on one of its legs. There was an unexpected further development as the lights in the room began to dim or flicker, individually at first and then together in unison. Philip's confidence and apparent abilities seemed to grow, to the point where he briefly appeared to those who had summoned him as a light mist. Eventually, after being observed by several independent witnesses and filmed as part of a studio television program, Philip's responses gradually became less frequent, until they finally ceased altogether. The spirit seemed to have tired of the brief existence which it had been called to, choosing instead to return to a state of inactivity. Fully acknowledging that this activity could only have been created via their own minds, Dr. Owen recorded several intriguing observations. If any member of the group was absent for a meeting or physically unwell, it was noted that Philip's spirit either did not appear or did so in an apparently weakened state. Several group members also reported poltergeist-like activity in their own homes, after they had returned from their weekly meeting. This suggested that their creation had either accompanied them to their residence, or their activities had somehow attracted the attention of an unrelated, genuine spirit entity. Keen to replicate their apparent success, the TSPR went on to form a second group, comprised of members who had not been part of the original experiment. As before, they would spend several weeks crafting an entirely fictional character, settling on Lilith, a French-Canadian girl who had opposed the Germans during World War II. Once again, after a sustained period, their attempts to will the soul of the wartime resistance fighter into existence met with apparent success. A degree of dialogue was established via a series of knocking sounds and table movements, though not as intensely as with the first group. Similar results would be obtained in further seances involving fictional characters, carried out not only by the TSPR, but other groups based as far afield as Australia. Many years on from the events of the Philip experiment, the fictional ghost's legacy remains something of a double-edged sword. On one hand, the research generated surprisingly little criticism or pushback from the scientific community towards the published results. However, there has never been any real agreement as to how what was witnessed came to be achieved. Despite none of the participants claiming to possess psychic powers, some commentators cite the experiments as proof that such latent abilities must truly exist. Others take a more grounded view, agreeing that it was nothing more than a shared hallucination created by those who participated, with each of those present subconsciously influencing the physical side effects. A smaller number of observers postulated that a real entity may well have been summoned from the astral plane, which then took on the identity of Philip as part of a deceitful act, impersonating their creation for its own demonic ends. As with numerous other assertions and trials of this nature, the perception of the event may be influenced as much by the observers as by the participants. Depending on the extent to which an onlooker believes in such things, they might choose to overlook someone else manipulating objects or even agree that an apparition is manifesting, even if it does not truly exist. Conversely, Some individuals may completely reject any inexplicable phenomenon, attributing it solely to deception and manipulation on the part of those involved. Much like the individuals gathered around the table during the Philip experiment, it could be that people often see only what they want to see. And as to how real it is, well, that is entirely within the eye and the mindset of the beholder.